The sun had barely risen over the small, barren town of Mill Creek when Sarah Caldwell stood at her kitchen window, staring out at the dusty, empty streets. The world outside felt like a place suspended in time, stuck somewhere between hope and despair. Sarah's life hadn't always been this way. She used to have dreams, ambitions, and a future she could look forward to. But now, all that remained was the weight of survival. Her husband had passed away 2 winters ago, leaving her to raise their young son alone. She had no family in town, no support system, and every day felt like a battle to keep going. But despite the struggles, Sarah had never given up. She had her boy, Samuel, and that was all that mattered. As Sarah wiped her hands on the flour-dusted apron she wore, she heard the faint sound of someone approaching the front door. Her ears perked up. It was rare for anyone to come to her house. She cautiously opened the door, and standing there was a man she didn't recognize, tired, gaunt, and clearly desperate. His clothes were torn, and his face was etched with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. In his arms, he cradled a tiny bundle wrapped in rags. The man's voice cracked as he spoke. "Please, ma'am, I don't know where else to turn. My wife, she's sick, and we haven't had anything to feed the baby. I don't have much to offer, but could you spare some milk?" Sarah's heart tightened as she looked at the frail baby in his arms. She could see the hunger in the child's face, the small cries that came from the bundle, desperate and weak. She didn't know what had brought this man to her door, but she knew what it meant. He was a father willing to do anything for his child. Without a second thought, Sarah stepped aside, gesturing for the man to come in. "Come inside," she said softly. "You and your baby are welcome here." The man's eyes filled with gratitude as he stepped into the warmth of the cottage. He looked around, taking in the small but cozy space, his shoulders sagging with relief. "Thank you, ma'am," he whispered. Sarah led them to the kitchen and immediately began to heat a small pot of milk. The baby, whose cries had softened as they entered the home, now rested in his father's arms, eyes half closed. The man seemed as if he were on the brink of collapse, his exhaustion overwhelming him. As Sarah poured the warm milk into a cup, she looked at the father, noticing the way his hands shook as he held the child. "You don't need to explain," she said, her voice steady but gentle. "I can see what you're going through. Just take care of your baby." The man didn't say anything at first. He simply nodded, his eyes filled with a silent appreciation. He handed the baby to Sarah, who instinctively cradled the child in her arms. As soon as the baby was in her care, Sarah could feel the warmth of life, the fragile vulnerability of the tiny human being who depended on her. She gently lifted the baby to her chest, rocking him softly. The child's cries subsided as he began to suckle. It was a natural reflex, one that Sarah had once known so well when her own son was an infant. As she fed the child, Sarah couldn't help but think of her own son, Samuel. He had been through so much, and so had she. But this child, this stranger in her arms, was a reminder of the tenderness that still existed in the world, even in the face of hardship. She glanced at the father, who stood by, watching her with a mixture of hope and guilt. "Thank you," he whispered again, his voice breaking as he looked at the baby in Sarah's arms. Sarah didn't say anything in response. She didn't need to. Her actions spoke for her. She knew what it meant to care for a child, to give them something that wasn't just food, but love. She wasn't just feeding this baby. She was giving him the warmth and comfort he so desperately needed things his mother was too sick to provide. As the baby fed, the man finally sat down at the small kitchen table, his face weary but grateful. Sarah continued to hold the child, her heart swelling with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in a long time. This was why she had never given up, she realized. Because there was always someone who needed help. And sometimes all it took was one person willing to give what little they had to make a difference. As the hours passed, Sarah and the man, whose name was Thomas, spoke quietly. He told her of his wife, who had fallen ill after a long, harsh winter. They had been struggling to survive, but no matter how hard Thomas worked, he couldn't find enough to feed his family. His wife's condition had worsened, and now it was just him and the baby, trying to get by. Sarah's heart broke as she listened to his story. She had been through her own hardships, but this man's pain was different. It was the kind of pain only a parent could understand, a parent who would do anything, sacrifice everything, for the well-being of their child. As the baby finished nursing, Sarah gently placed him back in his father's arms. She watched as Thomas carefully rocked the child, his eyes filled with a quiet love. "Thank you," he said again, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I would have done without you." Sarah smiled softly. "You don't need to thank me. I'm just doing what anyone would do. Your baby needs you, just like mine needed me." Thomas nodded, his eyes downcast. "I thought I had lost everything, but now I see there's still hope." Sarah stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the darkening sky. She didn't know what the future held for either of them, but she knew one thing for sure: sometimes the simplest act of kindness could change everything. In that small cottage, on that quiet evening, Sarah became the mother the child needed, not by birth, but by choice. She had given her heart, her warmth, and her strength to someone who needed it the most. And in return, she found something unexpected: the power of compassion, the healing that comes from giving when you have little left to give. Thomas looked at her, his gratitude evident. "You've saved us, ma'am." Sarah didn't reply. She didn't need to. She had already done more than she ever thought possible. She had shown him and the baby that there was still love in the world, even in the hardest of times. As the night settled in and the fire crackled softly in the hearth, Sarah couldn't help but feel a deep sense of fulfillment. In that moment, she wasn't just a woman who had survived hardship. She was a mother to a child in need, a protector of innocence, and a symbol of hope when everything else seemed lost. And that, she knew, was a gift she could never take for granted.